Good afternoon, Muskegon. It's time for Torn into your show for news, information, and more for November 4th, 2022. It's Friday, as you know, and welcome to the show. We got a lot to talk about. I have a lot of friends on today, so let's get to it. First of all, let's get the twin Melvin, Pastor C. Melvin Burns. You did a great job last week, man.
Hey, thank you, brother. I was just trying to hold up the standard you've created here.
You did that much more.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Sure.
Hey, the jobs report came out and it showed again they were expecting 200,000. It's 261,000. The unemployment rate went up to 3.7. It was 3.6 last month. So continued growth there. The Dow right now is just wishy-washy. So a lot of things going on, but we're here to talk elections.
Okay.
And I get to talk to my election team, the radio station's election team, part of the election team. Speaking of, we'll be covering the election Tuesday, starting at 3 o'clock, and we need to see you there. You can take part of that conversation election day by calling 231-727-5007 or 722-8338. And give us when you polled, or get this, better yet, go to a WVS 103.7 Facebook site or M106 and give us information as well. Now, people that are watching or listening, if you're listening right now and you would like to be a part of the show, to give us your input, please do so by watching those sites. You can even watch it on YouTube in high definition. Go to WVS 103.7 Beat and subscribe, and you can watch it live. Let's get right into it because we got a lot to talk about. Our guest today is no stranger to the show. He's part of the campaign team, a huge part, and we're waiting for Karen as she's coming in. But I call him the professor. Put your hands together for Professor David Takitaki. How you doing, sir?
I am doing great, and I realize now that I need to get you to introduce me when I'm walking into the classroom. It really get the students pepped up, right? If I had a man coming in first. Well, thank you, guys. Good to be back.
I do that. Jump into some James Brown, put a cape on you. I got you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think grade point averages would go up. At least would, right?
Hey, listen, I got you. Listen, guys. This is the last weekend of election coverage, and we all love politics and stuff but I tell you what, as I was telling you guys before, I've been been watching murder shows to find truth because these commercials have been driving me nuts.
Oh man.
Yeah, I am deeply sympathetic. I've actually had people over the course of this election cycle take a picture. They've got 50 pieces of mail on their table, and they're like, "Why do they do this?" I hate that, right? And the problem is that all of the research still shows it works. It doesn't change people who've already kind of made up their opinion. It doesn't inform anybody. But just like sales, who say, you got to make 5 to 7 points of contact in order to kind of move the sale along. Elections work the same way, and I guess until we start dialing in differently and paying better attention and making all that irrelevant, we're going to get buried in this stuff.
And that's really funny that you say that, because the thing is that we try to have all the candidates on so you can listen and be a educated person going in the polls, but more people vote on that 60 or 30-second soundbite or what they see on TV. It's crazy. It drives me nuts.
For a long time in the country, your parents' partisan preferences were the single biggest determinant of your personal political preferences, right? Mm-hmm. So it actually didn't matter what the candidates said or what the issues were. Mm-hmm. Whatever mom and dad did, whatever you got born into was what you did. And that trend is breaking some now. But it's still significant that A lot of people approach politics as a team sport, and it doesn't really matter what happens in terms of policy or law. It's whether or not my team is winning or losing. So we got a long way to go, but I'm glad that places like this are trying to get that information out. Maybe that's the new pitch line for the show, right? Watch Torn in 2 and you'll eventually get less mail.
I wish that was true. Let's jump into it. First of all, I wanted to say to people that watch the show, or you haven't decided yet, you can go back to our Facebook site, our YouTube site, M106 Facebook site, watch all the candidates that we had a chance to interview. And speaking of, I want to thank Lady J for all the phone calls that she made to get candidates. And that's a hard job. That's a lot of yes, a lot of no's, and then a lot of people changing their mind at the last second.
Right.
And so I want to thank her as well. So let's jump into what should we expect. Now, we're not going to make any projections. We're not going to tell you anything because we want you to not sit on the couch and say, well, the Republicans are going to win or the Democrats are going to win. But we're going to talk about some of the things that you should be expecting. Let's talk about polling first, Dave.
Sure. So there's been some questions about, how polls work and how reliable they are. And I think it's useful to take a minute to just step back and take a look at what a poll actually is. Now, if a poll is done well, what it does is it takes what they call a statistically random sample. So they ask people from all over the place, in this case, within maybe the bounds of a district. And if you get a statistically random sample, because of the way that probability works, you can get reasonably accurate poll projections by asking something on the order of 1,000 people for almost any population. And when you do that, you get a couple of important numbers. First number that you get, and the one that's really important, obviously, is the number itself, right? So you might get a 53 to 47, right? Republican 53, Democrat 47. Mm-hmm. But the other numbers you want to look for are the two numbers that they refer to as the margin of error and the confidence interval. And if you get a statistically random poll set up, you might have a 3% margin of error. And what that means is that the people who did the poll can say with reasonable confidence that the numbers they gave you are within 3% of the numbers they stated. So if it's 53-47, it could be 50-50, or it could be effectively like 56-44, anywhere in that range. And the next number they give you, that confidence interval number, tells you how confident they are in the fact that the actual result falls within that boundary. So most polls, good ones, have about a 95% confidence interval, which means they say, hey, look, 95% of the time, this race is going to be between 44 and 56. Mm-hmm. And that's the range. And if it ends up there, then that poll was an accurate poll, right? It predicted the race accurately. Mm-hmm. But again, that also means there's a 5% chance the outcome's outside of that range. Part of the problem is people don't look at the numbers in polls. Some polls are not conducted scientifically with a true random sample. Mm-hmm. And a lot of polls aren't presented with all of the right information.
Correct.
They'll be booked in by people who are candidates and they want to see a result that puts them ahead. Sometimes they even want to see a result that puts them just a little bit behind, right?
Right.
Their voters and gets them to turn out. Sometimes polls are opt-in polls, right? Like if you go onto a website and it says, hey, what's your favorite, I don't know, Backstreet Boy or something, or whatever, right? That's not a statistically random sample. That's going to be people who are going on and voting because they want to support their favorite, singer or whatever it is. So none of those are realistically accurate polls. And we're inundated with so many of these polls and numbers and statistics that, yeah, absolutely, they can all become functionally meaningless. Mm-hmm. So it's good to take polls with a grain of salt. But even with all of the drama around the 2020 presidential election and people not knowing which way it was going to go and all the polls being bad, if you go back and look in both 2016 and 2020, right, if you take an aggregate of the reliable polls, they all got it right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's a matter of knowing how to read a poll, what kind of polls actually work, and how to use them appropriately. Also, at the end of the day, we're a democracy. Polls are useful, but your vote is your vote, and that's a poll of one, and that's really the most important poll.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Burns.
You say that, Dave. For instance, the gubernatorial race here, I see a different message when I see the fundraising poll, which says this thing is very close. And then you see some of the polls that show the race. I mean, it could be double digits, maybe upper single digits. But when you see the fundraising, it's always things are close. We're closest as neck and neck almost. But that just seems when you talk about those differences, one of those cases where the candidate may want to put out different message. It seems like nobody wants to be way out front in
Right.
any of these polls.
That's the same thing as the congressional, the third. You have one candidate raising a ton of money, but they're saying that the race is really, really close.
Yes.
Yeah. And so if we're breaking down fundraising, it's a good thing to look at not just total dollars raised, which is important, right? That buys your media, that can be used to, support different kind of ads. But if you're looking at the fundraising, one of the things to look at are the differences between your total dollars raised and dollars raised in small amounts from donors in district. That's a better measure of support. And if you've got your political analysts who are kind of handicapping races and they're projecting who's going to win, that's a number they look at. Yeah, they look at the overall dollars. But if you've got on the left a bunch of progressive groups and labor unions who come in and throw a bunch of money at it, right? That may not necessarily be representative of electoral support in the district. Same thing if you look at the Republican side. If you suddenly got a bunch of Republican super PACs or conservative action groups, right, who are coming in and suddenly throwing a big block of money down, that's going to be useful in getting messaging out, but that may not necessarily translate into support in district the way in which a candidate who's got 1,000 small dollar donors who are giving to their campaign. That's a better representation of support.
Okay. With that said, let's get into races. What races are, and this goes out to both you guys, what races are you looking at to be a gauge on what's happening in the United States?
Nationwide? Of course, everybody's watching Georgia. But Nevada has gotten interesting. I think that's going to be an interesting one. That Senate race to kind of keep an eye on. It's kind of been going back and forth, so I think that'll be interesting nationally to keep an eye on.
What about you, Dave?
So I think if I'm looking at national races, yes, Georgia, yes, Nevada. The three big races in Arizona. Interesting. As a state that went blue for the first time in a long time in the last election.
Yeah.
In a state where you have several candidates who are very much cut from the Trumpian mold, right? As opposed to several candidates on the Democratic side who are in many ways kind of, centrist standard Democrats. That result will be very, very interesting, especially as a midterm year. Looking also nationally, Pennsylvania's races for governor and senator are going to be very interesting and very telling. And Pennsylvania is another one of these states that's been frequently in play. The Ohio Senate race looked more interesting earlier, but it seems to be moving out of any realm of being reasonably contested. But, who knows? We could still see things. And then lastly, the margins in Florida for both governor and Senate. Right now, it looks like, like Ron DeSantis seems pretty comfortably ahead, but it's hard to tell. One of the reasons why my national numbers are off, and this kind of taps back into polling, and I think this is worth noting. I was looking back at the numbers in terms of polling for the Kansas pro-choice amendment that passed back in August. It was the one that shocked the nation. Pre-race polling showed that effectively the pro-life position was 4 to 5 points ahead. And the actual vote ended up being 15 points in favor of the pro-choice position. And when you see reliable polling that far off, right, that tells me that there's a lot of strong political undercurrents going on across the country. And those are going to represent themselves differently in different states, depending on things like candidate quality and what other issues are on the ballot. To extrapolate on your question, Greg, I'm really looking at Prop 3 in the state of Michigan as a bellwether. Right? If Prop 3 motivates a lot of voters and passes, I think it's going to speak well for the other statewide Democratic candidates. If Prop 3 ends up galvanizing a conservative base against it, I think that's going to speak poorly for the other statewide Democratic candidates. So that's going to be one of my flags in the wind to see how things are going.
Before we go into Michigan, the polls are stating right now across the country, as far as motivation, that the motivation Republicans are showing a higher, they're polling higher about going to the polls versus Democrats by double digits. I was pretty shocked about it, and the same in Michigan, and with the Prop 3 being on the agenda, I was kind of wowed by that.
Mm-hmm.
Dave.
So I'm not surprised. Midterm elections are generally seen as referendums on the incumbent party, right? And in both Michigan and at the national level, the Democrats have power. To the extent that earlier in this election cycle, Senate Majority Leader McConnell effectively abjugated any kind of legislative agenda and said, we're just going after them, right? And as much as some people are like, oh, it may be bad policy, it is an effective political strategy, right? And I think if we pretend for a moment that you can shut out a lot of the other broad social and cultural issues, we are dealing with a inflationary cycle right now. And that alone, even though it's not the product of any particular policy and it is a global phenomenon, people are feeling that crunch in their wallets every week,
right,
and want it to stop. And if you've got someone who comes to you and says, hey, I can make it stop if you vote for me, that's going to be a pretty solid argument. And if you've got somebody who's in power and says, hey, look, we're trying to make it stop, we didn't cause it, but it's still happening, then it's going to be hard to give them credit when it's happening to you, right?
Hold on, Dave, because I need you, because you're preaching good. You need to say this all over again, because regardless of who was in party, we have to realize that this country was shut down. People stayed home. Now you had to try to jumpstart the country, jumpstart the economy, regardless who was in power. This economic thing that we're going through was going to happen regardless of whatever party. And I am surprised that the Democrat Party did not jump on that and said, well, the Republican Party spent $3 trillion when they were in control, but they didn't jump on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, part of it is that most people don't understand inflation, right? We went through a period in this country in which, not only were our businesses shut down for the most part, right, or a large number of them were, and many people out of work, but in order to help those people survive, we very wisely injected a bunch of cash into the economy, right? Some people got stimulus checks. We had massive amounts of PPP loans going out in order to kind of keep businesses afloat. We saw significant tax breaks for people with children, right, in order to help them through this period. And then we also lost millions of people reasonably between COVID, long COVID, retirement and the like from the workforce. All of that then coincided with this kind of re-engagement. And what happens is you've got people out there who've got a little bit of extra money, some of them a good bit of extra money, and they go and they want to spend it in the marketplace. Well, with businesses down and supply chains being crippled frequently because of things like the pandemic, because of things like the war in Ukraine, because of global issues, manufacturers have less access to stuff. And so if you have less stuff and more money, the price of the stuff is going to go up, right? That's the raw numbers on inflation. And that's why it's a global phenomenon, right? It's not just happening here, it's happening everywhere else.
Right.
Now, we, through the Fed, have certain tools we can use to try to mitigate inflation. That's one of the reasons you're seeing interest rates going up. When interest rates are low and there's lots of money out there, businesses expand, right? They build new factories and they add stuff, which is good for jobs. But once that money comes back out of the economy, if we go back to a net normal, some of those businesses fail, right? And so in order to kind of change the math, The Fed raises interest rates, businesses are slightly less likely to borrow. Maybe they invest more in their actual current infrastructure, and eventually products and dollars balance back out again, and inflation goes down. That's the math, and that's some of the tools that we're using to try to adjust this. Any administration, Republican or Democrat, in this position would be having to do what we're doing right now and making these adjustments. I think it's a complex message, right? It's hard. I got to kind of teach people that before I can then go into the finer details of economic policy.
Yeah.
And if the difference is sitting and listening to some poli-sci professor babble on for 5 minutes and try to teach you something, or have somebody else walk over and go, hey, you're hurting, it's their fault, let's get them.
Yeah.
It's hard to compete.
Yeah, which is happening. Which is exactly what's happening is when you try to explain inflation, when you try to explain the job market, the stock market, how all this relates to what's going on and what happened, that 20 or 30 or 60-second soundbite of Grand Rapids burning or the gas pump or whatever, just takes that and throws it out in the trash.
Yeah.
Pastor Burns.
Now, I think you're right on target. Not to get too much further in economics, but people are making as much money as they've ever made. Salaries are up, and unemployment is low. And I know we talked before. This is just such a new economy. You talked about the businesses failing. Most of the ones that are going to failed during the pandemic. And so, like you said, it's easy just to say, "Hey, you're paying more for stuff. It's those guys' fault." And it seems to me the latter part of the last month or so, you've seen that really more focus more in by the Republican candidates to really hit the inflation. Again, it kind of settled and started to pick up a little bit more.
All right, let's talk about debates and how important debates are. Let's talk about the governor's debate. Because that was actually only one in Michigan that we had, because everybody else was not debating. That ain't true. Some people did debate, but the governor's race did play a part. David, what do you think?
So we're going to see probably less debates moving forward as a general trend. And part of it is because the nature of our political discourse has soured, right? It's hard not to emphasize that point. It's not going to be two people standing on stage with a certain amount of respect for one another, debating the policies that they believe are better for the country or the state, and then letting the voters decide. Policy has not been significantly a part of many of these elections, and therefore the way in which candidates can most successfully present themselves in public is to either, one, attack their opponent, right? Or two, reasonably kind of tout their own thing despite their opponent. Any kind of interaction with an opponent at that point in time will either weaken your own arguments or potentially make you look bad. And there's always the risk you're going to accidentally say something on stage, whether you mean it or not, that can be used against you.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I am unsurprised that we saw in Michigan a seasoned politician who's already done a term in the governor's office handle herself competently, and a seasoned communicator whose background is in the media handle herself reasonably competently, right? There weren't any big swings that came about as a result of our debate here in Michigan. No real surprises happened as a result of the debate here in Michigan. So,
I kind of ended up going a 1-1 tie.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, like you said, there were no silver bullets in the debates. It was no smoking guns. It was just mannerisms. And I think what you said, Dave, is that if you look at the first race, and somebody had talked to the governor, she was more upset of dealing with attacks and was getting frustrated, and it showed. And the second debate came back and changed her mannerism. Your thoughts, and then my Pastor Burns his thoughts.
Yeah, I think any candidate is going to post game, any good candidate is going to post game their first debate performance and try to change a certain amount of tack and strategy. One of the benefits for a lot of candidates is that there are people like us who come out after a show or after a debate like that and talk about what their performance was, and they listen to these things, right? Maybe not them on the, every particular news feed, but their staffers and things are looking, assembling feedback, and then prepping their candidate for the second debate. So yeah, the fact that you saw a change in tone and a change in strategy is there. Generally, the perception is that if the debate is a tie, it's good for the incumbent, right? Incumbency is considered to be an advantage. And if the challenger isn't able to score anything particularly strong, then the perception is that the incumbency advantage remains. Where a challenger wants to have a good debate is if they themselves are maybe seen as unqualified or unknown, right? Debates are important for them in that particular scenario, as well as if they're running significantly behind. And that's another reason why sometimes the incumbents don't want to take the debate, right? Because there's little for them to gain, and all they need is for the challenger to, land a couple of good, rhetorical haymakers or catch them in a stumble, and it can shift the momentum of the race in the challenger's favor. And I think that's another reason that you're going to, and because debates are now more about these haymakers and attacks and kind of gotcha moments, you're going to see fewer incumbents, especially ones with a margin of a lead, being willing to entertain them.
Pastor Burns.
Well, the first thing I thought, if I squint hard and turn my head real quick, I can tell the difference which candidate is which. So that kept me awake. So, but what I'm always entertained by is I don't know how many people truly watch those and say, I don't know who I'm voting for. What I hear a lot of is you hear the people, some people, fake comments. Wow, I wasn't sure, but they really impressed me. And you didn't kind of look at their background and go, nah, they're not telling the truth. I don't know the way debates are, like that. If you see that and see anything that makes you decide which candidate, if you like in your face style, that may be it. If you like the cool, confident incumbent, but I don't know if you hear anything that really helps you decide. They kind of push their same issues. It is making less and less interesting TV.
You bring up an interesting point. It's a mud throwing contest, and whoever comes out the cleanest wins.
Yeah, then like the first debate, the next morning I'm reading the who won analysis, and a lot of people said, I guess Tudor Dixon did well or won or not to her, but again, it's based on I think the governor being a little maybe unprepared may not be the right word, but withstanding the attack, the assault that came her way and being more prepared the second time. But again, if the idea is you want to see these two candidates to see who do I prefer, again, I don't know it's disappointing that I don't think you really get that in those debates. You get more of 30-second sound bites that you're already getting.
Right. Dave, how important is it to you that you see candidates lowering their standards and going into a debate? This is happening in Georgia. Well, this guy, he's a polished pastor. I'm just a country boy that played football and has a Heisman Trophy. I don't speak well, but the standards, they're lowering the standards and the expectations.
I think that is very symptomatic of our change in our perception of what governance is, right? I talked before about the idea that it's a team sport, right? And it doesn't matter if Herschel Walker has a good idea or he's a competent politician or he's even a moral human being, right? If we elect him, our team gets ahead.
Yes.
Right? So we want to do that. And because of the fact that a lot of politics has become much more brutal and much more tribal, we can't ignore the idea that there's a lot of voters out there who are no longer motivated by policy. Many of them are motivated by fear, right?
Right.
There's a significant number of people in this country who believe that, that the Democratic Party is somehow a globalist pedophile cult that's drinking the blood of babies. And it's not like they're not afraid to say this on TV, because some of them are saying it on TV, right?
Right.
And if you are somebody who doesn't know that much about policy and doesn't know that much about governance, but you're afraid that the blue candidates are going to drink baby blood, then it really doesn't matter what the red candidate is or does. As long as they prevent the baby blood from being drunk, right? That's part of the problem here.
Yes.
Is that in attempting to gain political traction and gain political leverage and win races, we've seen a massive activation of these untrue, fear-based political tactics. And to the extent that many of your traditional kind of Republican and conservative actors have lost control of the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Because people who, they use this to kind of rile up a base and get people to vote for them. But now people who really believe this stuff are also running, and they can't beat them in primaries. And when you hear Mitch McConnell talking about candidate quality, right? That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Right? That's what he's talking about. So yes, when you've got somebody like a Herschel Walker up there who's essentially saying, hey, look, I don't know anything about this, but I'm not that guy, right? That's the base he's appealing to. And we as the public in general are so kind of focused on the team sport that we forget that governing the process of absorbing massive amounts of statute law and evaluating constitutional principles and coming up with solutions to major and emerging problems and trying to manage the economy and guarantee rights and prevent the erosion of our civil liberties is a hard job that requires a significant amount of expertise, right? And people don't pay attention to that. They're like, well, this one's is blowing up the world in the direction that I want it blown up in, so I'm going to vote for that person. I will equate it to my dying day that if you look at somebody who is you wouldn't do this for your doctor, right? You wouldn't be like, well, you know what? This guy, sure, he's got a lab coat and a degree and he's performed 100 successful surgeries, but this guy, he tells it like it is and isn't afraid to, he's completely unqualified and has never done anything before. And actually, he has a record of fraud in terms of medical, but this guy, he really speaks to like I do, and I want him to do my surgery. No, we don't do that because we've completely devalued expertise and competence.
Excellent metaphor.
Right.
Well, and Herschel Walker is polling 3 points ahead, by the way. So, Pastor Burns.
Two things I want to throw out to you guys that kind of crossed my mind. And David touched on it. One, what effect we think we'll see with the we got the Trump Republicans and the non-Trump Republicans, for lack of a better term.
I was going to bring up that question.
Yeah, no, we know we had some races in the primaries, but are we going to see an effect? And some states, where we have renegade Republicans or whatever you want to call them. And then the other part would be, what about the Biden effect? In this race?
Let me tackle that first. I think after this election, you're going to see the Republican Party break up into two parties. You're going to have the traditional Republican Party, which is shrinking and then you're going to have the Trump Party. And it's going to divide into two. It's already doing it right now. And if you look at races, you're having a lot of Republicans coming out and supporting Democrats. So I think you're going to see that, number one. Number two, the Biden effect. What you're seeing with the president right now, I tell people, and I like to hear what Dave says on this. You can't judge how a president is doing until 2+ years into his him serving. Then you can judge, okay, how's he doing? At this point, the Biden effect, he's had so much. I mean, like, again, country closed, dealing with a virus, dealing with so many things that he had to work on and clean up as far as policy wise. And then you have what's happening in the Senate with Mitch McConnell and a senator from West Virginia. Oh my gosh. Anyway, that don't want to break the filibuster. It's going to be real interesting to see because there's rumors and talk that there are some Democrats that don't want to see President Biden run again. David.
Which is suicide.
So I'll start with the Biden effect. Obviously, anytime you have a incumbent in the White House who is running positively with the people, that's a good thing. They are running underwater. That's less good thing for their party. Midterms are one of the hardest times to make that case and to win it. Biden's poll numbers in terms of his overall approval are underwater. Now, the thing to look at in that, and the thing you got to break out is if you ask the second question in terms of, you disapprove of president, yes, or approve of him, no, why? Like, what's the next question? And if you break out Biden's numbers, a good chunk of his disapproval is actually from the left, who are upset that he's not running harder to the left.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So if you factor them aside, he's still underwater, but he's not as far underwater as it looks like he might be otherwise. So that's important to note if you're kind of looking at, does the president have coattails? Is he able to pull things over the line? What kind of effect does his performance have on the greater election? Right now, from everything we can see, I would guess as of right now, he is going to have your standard impact on a midterm election, which means he will be a slight drag to his ticket, right? Now that's going to be regional as well, right? Because he has done some big things that are significant in terms of like the potential student loan forgiveness, even though that's currently being challenged in courts, things along his infrastructure bill, which he actually got through. So there's a lot of things he's done that the American people have felt and have noticed, but may not have felt universally, right? Not everybody's happy about student loans, but that's a base that may not be something that is easy to pull, but will be there in terms of, people looking to support that and to reward the party that is bringing that kind of debt relief. So again, Biden effect is going to be hard to gauge, but none of the numbers are so far to one side or the other right now that makes me think it's going to deviate from historical norms. And again, in historical norms, it's a slight drag on the midterms. So I would expect that to be where it boils out. Now, in terms of the rest of it, in the national trend too, there's a lot of chaos. Right? There's a lot of policies that have been felt unequally and have been implemented in ways that some people are very happy about and other people aren't. I'd be hard pressed to predict how that's going to turn out because remember, we don't have any truly national races, right? We have statewide Senate races, we have district-wide races, we have governor's races. There's no president on the ballot. So in some ways, the national level poll numbers aren't as important as the geographically bounded ones that are actually governing races.
Yes.
If you look at what's happening with Democrats, far as the elections that they're running, a lot of the Democrats are shying away from the president and going to former President Obama to come in and speak in the last rallies, which is an indication where they're trying to shy away from the current president.
That's entirely common when the president is seen as potentially a divisive figure or like currently his poll numbers are underwater. Plus, let's not lie. If you have the opportunity to have a somewhat grandfatherly Joe Biden speaking at a rally talking about monarchy, or Barack Obama coming in with all of the energy of a force of nature and the oratorical skills of basically the patron saint of speech. Yeah, I'm picking Obama every time. Right?
Sorry, Joe.
Yeah. So let's not make any doubt here as to if I have between the two of them.
Yeah, if you just joining the show, you are listening and watching Torn in Two. This is a political team. We're just talking about some of the things that you can expect, breaking things down for Tuesday. What about this? Let me throw this in the mix, especially Michigan. Some of these races, matter of fact, this is going to be throughout the country. Races are going to be decided slower. Number one, a lot of races is going to be days before they're decided. Number two, A lot of races are going to end up in court. Number 3. Am I correct on that?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah. It simply is going to take. Now, we've seen some changes, and there's some more potential changes as to at what time can elections officials begin processing mail-in ballots, right?
Mhm.
Because if you have to have a team that on the beginning of election day when the polls open, you're tracking open mail ballots and feeding them through machines. And then you also have to have teams worth of volunteers out at all your different polling places who then collect those ballots and bring them all back in. The physical process of counting votes, especially because it looks like we're seeing increased turnout, right, is just going to take longer, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
If you add in the fact that we're seeing increasing amounts of people who are, in some senses, legitimately being poll observers and challenging ballots and elections, and in some cases, in bad faith, in order to disrupt elections processes, saying that they're poll observers and going in and challenging ballots really for no reason other than to slow things down,
Mhm.
right? That is also a problem in terms of processing election results, right? And there's an inherent issue here when it comes to the idea that many of the voters who are voting in the more conservative lines tend to vote in small rural districts in which it's easy to drive up, get out of your car, cast your ballot, and be back on the road in 5 minutes. And many of the more progressive and liberal leaning voters are voting in cities where you can have lines that stretch for hours,
Mhm.
right? A delay of 10 minutes could disenfranchise nobody in a rural district and could end up resulting in 50 or 60 people not getting a chance to vote in a major city, right?
Yes.
So changes between person and in-person voting, all that stuff is going to make everything take longer.
Yeah.
We've seen a culture in which the legitimacy of elections is not only challenged, but there are many people who now presume they're simply not legitimate unless they win.
Yeah.
And a additional culture, and not, let's not make any mistake here, groups who can successfully raise funds and make money on post-election challenges and the idea of these kind of partisan audits and things like that. It's one of the reasons why I think the language in our current Michigan Prop 2 says that it would be a constitutional prohibition against these kind of hack job partisan audits, if that proposal passes, right? So yes, to all of your questions with a little bit more explanation.
Yeah. Some of the states that had these so-called reforms after 2020, those will be the first time we'll see some of those. When again, I didn't follow them all, but some where they literally are taking, based on certain controversies, taking the franchise away from the citizens and putting it in the state legislators. So I think Georgia was one of those, and Arizona, Texas had something like that. So some close races. Again, we'll see all of those, and the lawsuits kind of in play. But just to correct you, Professor, it wasn't candidates. We saw candidates win, but the president lose, and they challenged the validity of the election, not just if they won or lost.
Correct. Yes, they challenged the legitimacy of the presidential election on the same ballot that put them in Congress.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There was a trend. There was a trend where more people were going independent and splitting their ticket and voting Democrat and voting and getting away from voting straight ticket. I can tell you what, I can guarantee you that this election is going to go back to that where people are voting straight ticket. Your thoughts, guys?
Think so?
Yep, I think so. Down the line.
I think, well, I was thinking about this in my head. I think there's a local race that's going to spoil a lot of ballots. And and this is just a local thing. There was county commissioner, I forget what district it is, where Mr. Page and Mr. Williams are running against each other. That could
Ooh.
create some spoiled ballots.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting race.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of people who split tickets when they have the opportunity to kind of hear out the candidates. There are also a lot of people for whom ticket splitting and kind of party vacillation for them is part of just making sure things don't get too far out of hand and things don't go too far in any one direction, right? They try to look for it to be a moderating influence. it's difficult if you kind of zoom back out and look at the entire political diaspora to say that is currently a moderating influence, because we see a great deal of extremist energy in both parties, but an overwhelming amount of extremist energy on the far right now. So it's, I'm not sure that we're going to see major changes, because I don't know if the people who were willing to kind of, bounce back and forth from one party to another are necessarily going to go, oh my gosh, this is an incredibly important moment. I need to back one party for the future of democracy. So if they weren't tuned in enough to know before, I'm not sure that they're tuned in enough to know now. And for the people who are, maybe splitting their ticket because they know these individuals in a local sense, I don't know that the national political issues will be enough to make them stop splitting the ticket. When they can be like, hey, you know what? I know Joe, and yeah, he's on the other side, but I think he's a good guy, and I'm going to support him because I think he's a good voice to have on the county commission or whatever it is, right? So I don't know how much we're going to see a change in ticket splitting for this race.
Yeah, the other thing, a lot of people that think they're independent, for all practical purposes, aren't when it comes to voting. And I think both party affiliations probably down to 40%. Is that correct, Professor?
It's actually lower than that for the most part. Democrats are in the high 30s, Republicans in the low 30s.
Well, again, and as you know, once they ask you 3 or 4 questions and they go, you're a Democrat. So, I said to say people think they're independent, but they really aren't. And they find, when they faced with choices, they tend to vote one way or the other. There's a lot real smart people who really are actually independent voters.
And let's not mess around. The party affiliation, it can be a derogatory term nowadays, right?
Yeah,
people are angry enough, and politics is divisive enough that being known as a Democrat or a Republican publicly can subject you to not only criticism but social ostracization, right? As things get hotter and people get more both kind of reactionary and upset. Just having, there's questions about people putting signs in their yard. They're like, yeah, I'm supporting this person, but I don't want a sign in my yard because I don't want to deal with the grief, right?
Right.
The same thing is true for partisan identification.
Right. I've noticed a lot of that. One of the things that you mentioned before is that if you support Republicans or Trump, it's instantly you're going to get bashed because of what happened in the Republicans and what happened January 6th. Or if you go blue, it's you, like you said, you're drinking baby's blood and eating parts. It's got so extreme, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to point out too, like, the messaging is significantly off. And I don't want to make this a liberal conservative, dimensional switch here, right? But if we're talking about the small fraction of the Republican Party that is, essentially attempting to alter the rules of American democracy and attempted to stop the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th, I think that's legitimate criticism of that small portion. And if the rest of the party were willing to distance themselves from that, there would be no problem, right? Like, these people don't speak for us. They're not part of our deal. But the current dynamic on that side is that all of the energies on that kind of front. And many of the more moderate, more conservative, more responsible Republicans don't want to oppose it, because then you see what happens to people like Liz Cheney and Peter Meyer. You are right. Office. The flip side of that, the counter narrative, is completely fantastical, right? It's the blood eating and the babies and Pizzagate and the craziness. That's not to say that there aren't criticisms to be made of the Democratic Party, but the legitimate criticisms are being passed over in favor of these much more out there conspiracy elements, because that's what's motivating elements of the base, and that's part of the danger, and probably also part of the reason we're not going to see a lot of ticket splitting.
Would you guys say? Would you agree that people say that our democracy is in trouble?
Oh God, yes. I think definitely so. I couldn't pick a point prior to 2020 to say yes, other than some of the things like participation, those kind of things. But man, the lack of trust in elections, trust in elected officials, it to me is frightening, because the people who you counted on to protect the institution were the people who participated in it.
Mhm.
Those are the very people that seem to be hell bent on burning it to the ground.
Yeah. There's no way to present this in a way that pretends to be neutral, because all of the facts, unfortunately, are yes, the democracy is at risk. We had a seated president who, prior to his election, declared the election functionally corrupt if he lost.
Yes.
We have a seated president who organized and worked with individuals within state party apparati to submit slates of fake electors in an attempt to corrupt the election result. We have a president who summoned and organized an insurrection on January 6th in order to stop the peaceful transition of power. We have a president who, in the aftermath of the election, knowingly and willfully removed from the American people's possession classified documents, including nuclear secrets and details of our enemies, or at least our adversaries' defense forces, and then refused to return them and lied about having them. That same person is challenging the legitimacy of American elections across the country. That same person solicited electoral officials in multiple states, attempting to get them to essentially falsify election results and hand him the election. That person is currently under investigation in many of those states for those actions. Right?
Well, if you look across the country, I mean, across the world, everybody's watching the United States, and this whole thing of how we are conducting elections and what happened in the past is now spreading to other countries where they're challenging the elections. They're false, they're rigged. Look at just what happened in Brazil. But I'm so glad that was a smooth transition there. Let's go to Houston, Texas. Question to you.
Michael Anthony Smith says Democratic messaging is a problem.
Michael Anthony Smith is correct. Democratic messaging is a massive problem. Democrats are not good at taking complex issues and boiling them down into kind of kitchen table conversation points to get their message across.
Yes.
Even earlier in this very conversation, right, we talked about inflation and we talked about rates like that, right? Yeah. At any point in time, if there was somebody who was like wearing the Democratic badge in this room, that person should have jumped on the fact that we did not talk about the fact that corporate profits are at 60-year highs.
Yes.
Right. And so when it comes to why are people paying more and everybody's pointing at Biden, Democrats are not doing a good job at pointing at, the recent multi-billion-dollar profit rollout, from ExxonMobil, as we're talking about gas prices. Right. They are not particularly good at messaging. And part of that's because the Democrats tend to be a coalition party. Right.
Exactly.
It's people from all different causes and, who are trying to kind of, move together in a generally liberal or progressive way. But they're not as well unified as Republicans are, and they don't have as slick a messaging apparatus.
They're terrible, because the thing is that is a very simple message that they can say is like gas prices are not controlled by the government. It's controlled by boardrooms.
But even with that issue, the president mentioned the other day, his response was, what was it, a windfall tax?
Windfall profits tax, yeah.
So you throw that tax word out, and all of a sudden, also Democrats taxing again. So even attacking that issue was like, he touched on it, but then he said the wrong word. He could have said, we're going to go after him, we're going to stop him, but don't use the T word. But I agree with you. The coalition of the Democratic Party, you talk about oil profits, but then you got some senators in some oil producing states that don't want to see you, touch that, or you got like a senator from West Virginia who don't want to hear you talk about, alternate fuel sources and those kind of things. So that coalition, I think people are saying the message is bad, but it's hard to come up with a single message that everybody lines up behind that.
And so just take a peel on the difference. Windfall profits tax, more government involvement. You want to flip the script, you message it something like this: corporate elites are taking money out of your pocket.
There you go.
You want to vote for the guy who's going to let him do more of that, or the guy who's going to let him do less?
Yeah.
How simple is what you just said?
Right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, then that's the difference, right?
Yeah.
You can vote for somebody who's going to let them jack up the price even more and take more of the money out of your family's pocket, or you can vote for the guy who's going to stop them. Which one do you want?
And I was surprised that the Democratic Party didn't take that attack, but they stayed on the abortion issue. and they continue to stay on the important abortion issue when the number one thing right now that's on people's mind, polling, is inflation.
Yeah.
Well,
My pockets.
let me throw this out here just a little bit. One, part of the problem is a lot of the people in the rooms where these decisions are, and I've been in some of these rooms, Faith, you know, truth be told, some of the people in the rooms where these decisions are happening occasionally get kind of caught up in the fact that they understand inflation, and therefore they understand there's little that they can immediately do about it. And so, you know, they kind of deflect and go, let's focus on the issue where we can do something.
Right.
Also, these rooms are not universally kind of unified in terms of what message is important, right? If you've got a room and there are 5 or 6 people in there who are adamant of the fact, no, reproductive rights is huge, the Roe reversal is massive, not only can we use this politically, but it's going to be incredibly important nationally, that can be a winning argument in that room. And then you look at something like Kansas, and it appears to also be a politically winning argument. And so we're going to be able to do a lot of guesswork, and we'll, after the election, be able to do a lot of kind of, you know, armchair quarterbacking about what would have been the better tack to take. But I'm not sold on the fact that emphasizing reproductive rights was a mistake. I am concerned that they have not done a good enough job messaging the economic issues and dealing with inflation.
Right. All right. This question is going out to both of you guys. We're running out of time. Man, it went fast. I'm sitting at home, and I don't know who I'm voting for right now. What is it going to take for somebody to be educated in a couple days on who to vote for without looking at commercials?
Get you a shiny quarter and
get you a shiny quarter.
No.
I'll give and again, I'm not unbiased in this, right? I have to live in this country after this election, so I have my preferences. But I look at it like this: I have been in favor of both liberal and conservative policies in the past. I have supported liberal and conservative politicians in the past. Most of my track record in the last several years has been pretty strongly liberal, with a few specific personal exceptions for individuals who I knew were of excellent quality on the Republican side. Right now, it is not conservative values and small government politics that are motivating this incarnation of the Republican Party.
No.
What you have is a fringe, populist, authoritarian, potentially even Christo-fascist group that has taken control, and a large number of otherwise good sense conservative people who are afraid to oppose them and are hoping that they can right the ship and get control back if they win 1 or 2 more elections, right? They keep power, and they can move their policy through, and eventually they'll be able to kind of, you know, stop the crazies from kind of running the show. I am not at all convinced they can do that. I am completely convinced, actually, that the fringes on that side, the fringes who are blessing swords and giving them to Doug Mastriano and who are determining that the country be run on biblical principles or else, I'm convinced that those people have the momentum on that side. And I know that if we see a Democratic victory in this election, you're going to see essentially a stabilization and hopefully a restoration of some of the systems of power. And I'm not convinced we see that if there's Republican victories. I'm very concerned for the future of democracy if the R's get the win here. And I don't think that's because good-natured conservative people aren't going to try to get it back. I think they've made a monster, let it out of the cage, and no longer have control.
Yeah.
The crack has been released. Pastor Burns, last question.
Yeah. If you're this week and you're still undecided, go to these candidates, read their, skip all the campaign stuff. Go and read about their biographies, their history, what they're like. That's your best attempt. Skip all the campaign stuff. Who they've been in the past is who they're going to be. Again, not to take extreme, but if they've been an election denier in the past, they may not talk about it in the campaign, but that tells you where they are. If you don't like Proposal 3, if they've supported in the past or they didn't support it, that's who they are. They may not want to talk about it for reasons, but go through their history. You can find it all on the internet. Pick the candidate you think aligns with you, but the information's there, but don't rely on those. Don't rely on the 30, 60-second commercials to know who these people are.
All right, Pastor Burns, David, Professor Taki. I will see you guys Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday of next week, because it's going to be a long week. Hey guys, that's the end of 22. Go out and do something positive. Go sow a seed in someone's life. We'll talk to you. We'll see you at Tuesday, 3 o'clock election coverage. Take care.
All right.
God bless.
Take care now.